let you know?
I do not have slides. In recent years, I found my research is not very photogenic, and I don't know what to put on slides except a lot of text. So I'm going to spare you that. But you'll just see me talking here. Yes. So as Jess said, my talk is titled "Nothing About Us Without Us: Disabled Archaeologists and the Archaeology of Disability." And so for the past 30 years, the slogan of the disability rights movement in the US has been "Nothing about us without us." But since long before the slogan, disabled self-advocates had been resisting the structural ableism that leads to non-disabled medical providers, policymakers, family members making decisions about our lives without our input. Disabled people continue to fight for the right to interpret our own lives and to be believed when we do. But archaeologists are constantly doing work about us without us. Although archaeologists increasingly, although not enough, consult or even collaborate with the descendants of racially marginalized communities that they're researching, studies of historic period institutions for people with disabilities are rarely, if ever, studied in collaboration with institutional survivors, their families, or community members with the same disabilities. Similarly, I've never heard of a bioarchaeological study of the remains of a disabled person that was done in deep collaboration with modern people with similar embodied experiences. But the problem is even bigger than that. Archaeologists study human communities, and all human communities contain disabled members. Even the 20th century eugenic attempts to remove us from the population, while effective in causing massive suffering and death, did not succeed in eradicating us. So we should be assuming that any community being interpreted by an archaeologist has disabled members, even if the meaning of disability varies enormously across cultural difference and time and space. Just as the trailblazing feminist archaeologists of the 1980s argued that all societies contain women, so androcentric interpretations are limited and non-rigorous, I argue that all societies contain disabled people, so non-disabled centric approaches are limited and non-rigorous. In this paper, I draw on equity critiques and content critiques in the sense that Alison Wiley used those terms. I'll explain in a moment, of ableism in archaeology and feminist standpoint theory to argue that archaeology must become more accessible, equitable, and inclusive so that disabled archaeologists can build sustainable careers and so that disabled non-archaeologist stakeholders can be welcomed into our knowledge production practices. Only by including disabled people's perspectives in our research design and interpretation of our evidence can we tell stories about the human past that are both rigorously constructed and contribute to building a less ableist society. So in 1997, Alison Wiley characterized feminist archaeology as being comprised of two interwoven strands. Content critiques addressed sexism and androcentrism in the content that archaeologists create, that is, our interpretations of the human past. Equity critiques examined how sexism manifests among archaeologists in the present, in our disciplinary demographics and power structures, and in our interpersonal professional relationships. These two strands are necessarily intertwined. Indeed, Wiley calls for more integrative analyses bringing the two together. She wrote, quote, "While such equity critiques provide fascinating detail on ways in which women are marginalized within archaeology, rarely are they used as a basis for understanding how the content of archaeological knowledge is shaped. And although content critics provide compelling evidence that the silences and distortions they identify are systematically gendered, rarely do they make any connection between these and the gender imbalances in the training, employment, and reward structures of the discipline documented by equity critics." Now, of course, in the 2.5 decades since that article was published, a number of archaeologists, including several of us in this very Zoom room, have worked to bring those two strands together. but I think her call remains relevant. And there's much more to do to bring equity and content critique together in order to understand how systemic oppression in the present shapes the knowledge we produce about the past and vice versa, both in terms of the gender issues widely discussed and other forms of social difference and marginalization. And as the Nothing About Us Without Us slogan reminds us, many disabled activists see equity and content critique as always inherently, necessarily interwoven. When disabled people are inequitably shut out of positions of power over our own lives and the ways our experiences are understood, our lives are interpreted in problematic and dehumanizing ways. When our lives are interpreted in problematic and dehumanizing ways, that interpretation reinforces the status quo in which disabled people are shut out of knowledge production and decision-making processes. A commonly cited example is Autism Speaks, the largest autism-related advocacy organization in the US. For much of its existence, Autism Speaks had not a single autistic board member. It was autism speaking, not autistic people speaking, and focused on funding research into ways to cure or prevent autism. Now, one of its 21 of 28 board members is autistic, according to their board website, and they did remove the word cure from their mission statement in 2016. But both of those fairly small moves forward were the result of long-term advocacy by autistic people. In contrast, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network says, quote, most self-advocates agree that autism doesn't need to be cured. Instead of wasting time and money on something that isn't possible and that autistic people don't want, we should focus on supporting autistic people to live good lives. As autistic people, we know more about autism than anyone else. We know the problems that autistic people face and have lots of ideas about how to solve them. Some non-autistic people say they are autism experts and try to make policies about autism without talking to autistic people ourselves. These policies usually don't help us and sometimes even make things worse for us. That is why autistic people have to be involved in making policy. We have a right to have our voices heard in the national conversation about us. There are no exceptions, end quote. I'd like to add, just to make it explicit, archaeology is not an exception. Okay, so how has these ideas come into archaeology? There have been some equity critiques about disability in archaeology. So what do we know about disabled archaeologists? In terms of quantitative data, there are a few statistics about how many archaeologists have disabilities. And in fact, the only demographic survey of archaeologists that I know of that has included disability is my own forthcoming study of research funding equity in anthropology and archaeology. 1,114 respondents who are members of at least one of 10 anthropology or archaeology professional organizations answered the question, do you have any disabilities, including physical, sensory, developmental, mental health, intellectual, and learning disabilities, as well as chronic health conditions? 1 in 4 answered yes, says 275 or 24.78%. Among archaeologist respondents specifically, the percentage of respondents who are disabled was similar, 176 out of 727 or 24.21%. Sociocultural anthropologists and especially biological anthropologists were more likely to be disabled, while linguistic anthropologists were less likely, but the variations were not statistically significant. All this data is in a forthcoming report that will be published online this winter. I found these numbers shockingly high, considering how few and recent the publications on ableism in archaeology have been. Indeed, my own research on disabled archaeologists shows that many of us are hiding in plain sight. While people with apparent disabilities are often shut out of field schools and therefore archaeology careers entirely, those of us who can pass as non-disabled are much more likely to get in the door. Yet managing the stress of negotiating or living without our accommodations and keeping track of who does and does not know about our stigmatized identities is difficult and takes our effort and our energy away from the work of archaeology itself. And we're not wrong to be concerned about stigma. A recent British study of archaeologists with dyslexia showed that 37% of respondents had experienced discrimination at work. And it seemed that many of those who hadn't had not disclosed their dyslexia. So it was many of the people who had disclosed their dyslexia had experienced outright discrimination. Some of the issues disabled archaeologists face are the same problems that are facing our disabled comrades in other disciplines. The themes of disclosure, negotiating accommodations, working at the relentless pace of neo-labeled academics experiences across fields of study. Oops. But archaeology has its own unique culture, much of which focuses around fieldwork. As I and others have emphasized, our fieldwork focus reinforces systemic sexism, classism, discrimination against parents, and perhaps most of all, colonialist extractivism. But it's also ableist because archaeological sites are such inaccessible places for so many disabled people. Not only are they rarely accessible to those with mobility-related disabilities, but they may be loud, bright, especially hot or cold or wet or dry, and often they're far away from medical care. Although some archaeologists, notably the late Teresa O'Mahony, who founded the Enabled Archaeology Foundation, have come up with ways to make sites more accessible to more people or to manage chronic illness in the field, as an article by Clem, Hildebrand, and Myers from a couple of years ago in Advances in Archaeological Practice discusses, there are field sites that will likely always remain inaccessible to at least some people. When we treat fieldwork as the only real archaeology, we're telling disabled people that they're not welcome, even if some basic accommodations would make a particular field site accessible to them, even if they're doing fabulous work in the lab. The stigma of disability in a discipline where the physicality of fieldwork is so prized means that disability is rarely discussed, despite the large number of disabled archaeologists. This silence makes it difficult to build community, advocate for change, or to explicitly draw on our disabled positionality to inform our research. Furthermore, this exclusion of people with apparent disabilities means that disabled archaeologists as a community do not represent the vast diversity of the disabled community as a whole, and people with certain kinds of disability experience are mostly or entirely excluded from interpreting the archaeological record. Despite all these problems, disabled archaeologists are persisting, building communities of solidarity, and speaking up about our needs. The Enabled Archaeology Foundation is a UK-based charity that seeks to, quote, empower, enable, and combat negative attitudes towards the involvement of disabled people in heritage, end quote. In 2021, I co-founded the Disabled Archaeologists Network, which, quote, is a coalition of disabled archaeologists committed to providing an open and welcoming space to all disabled and disability questioning people. The DAN operates under the premise that disability is a social, political, and intersectional lived experience. We are building a community where disabled archaeologists can access an international network of fellow archaeologists in professional, compliance, and academic archaeology, unquote. There's a growing number of published equity critiques focusing on ableism in archaeology, as well as in other subfields of anthropology. But what about disability-related content critique? Well, it's starting to happen. There are two main ways, as I alluded before, that archaeologists study disability in the past: bioarchaeology and the historical archaeology of disability-related institutions. In both areas, disability studies theories are beginning to make some headway, but our discipline is generally multiple decades behind the leading edge of disability studies. We have a lot of work to do to catch up. I'll begin with bioarchaeology, although I'm a little nervous because I acknowledge that I'm not a bioarchaeologist or a biological anthropologist, and I'm looking forward to hearing the reactions from those of you who are. But traditionally, paleopathology, in which medical descriptors or diagnoses are applied to human remains, has been the most common way that archaeologists have discussed disability at all. Although many conditions do not affect bones and therefore are rarely seen in the archaeological record, many congenital conditions, illnesses, and injuries do leave osteological traces that can be identified by bioarchaeologists, which gives us a lot of amazing information about health and embodied experience in the past. The problem is that the medicalized definitions of these conditions most commonly used by bioarchaeologists don't really get at disability as a whole. Disability is not only experienced in the body, but in society. Diagnosing a body with a modern medical term is just the start of understanding that person's experience of disability. In the 1980s, British disabled activists and scholars developed a theory known as the social model of disability. Although not without its detractors and limitations, the social model has had an enormous impact on disability studies and activist movements. In this model, impairment is separated from disability. A body may be impaired, but it is the ableist social conditions in which the person lives that are disabling, not the impairment itself. Uh, I've seen several people on this call wearing glasses, which suggests that there are people with visual impairments present. And I bet even more have visual impairments and are wearing contact lenses. But in a society where glasses are fairly readily available and generally socially acceptable off of the elementary school playground, mild nearsightedness or farsightedness is not actually disabling. Most people who wear glasses don't consider themselves disabled. Similarly, the people who developed the social model, many of whom were wheelchair users, argued that it was not their inability to walk that was disabling, but rather the lack of ramps, curb cuts, and elevators in their built environment. If their environment was accessible, their impairment would not be a disability. A few bioarchaeologists have begun to apply the social model to their work. The most notable examples were published in a volume, Bioarchaeology of Impairment and Disability, edited by Burns and Muller in 2017. Like in any edited volume, the chapters vary, but overall, I think this is a great book, and I'm really glad it exists. But as you may have noticed, I spoke about the social model being developed in the 1980s and the book being published in 2017, at least 3 decades of lag time. If we'd been, talking to disabled people all this time, we would have been using the social model in the 80s and have long since started reckoning with the various critiques and alternatives that have come out of disability studies in the decades since. The historical archaeology of disability institutions is a much smaller field than paleopathology, but over the past decade or so, there have been a growing number of archaeologists studying historic Hansen's disease communities, historically known as leper colonies, tuberculosis sanatoria, lunatic asylums, as well as other forms of hospitals and institutions. These studies often engage with disability studies scholarship, but I've rarely seen them engage with the most radical work, either on abolitionism, decarceration, and deinstitutionalization, or from the field of MAD studies and the psychiatric survivor movement. Those are really the cutting edge disability studies theory that makes the most sense to engage, but it's not usually making its way into the archaeology scholarship. And so in both of these arenas, anti-ableist content critique is happening. It's just shockingly new and simultaneously behind the curve. As more and more amazing work comes out in disability studies, and as disabled activists outside of the academy continue to build knowledge and power, we could be doing so much better. So that brings me back to Nothing About Us Without Us. In order to study past disabled people's lives and the lives of communities that included disabled people, so all of human communities, we need disabled people to be involved in producing knowledge. Disabled activists have told us so. Nothing about us without us. Within anthropology in particular, Cassandra Hartley has theorized disability expertise, arguing that lived experience of disability and ableism are in fact forms of expertise on par with academic expertise, or in fact being more important than it. With co-authors Lori Wilkie and Katie Kinkoff, I made a similar argument specifically for archaeology. But even if disabled activists and scholars weren't making this clear, archaeologists, especially feminist archaeologists, should already know this. I alluded to Conkey and Spector's argument about androcentrism in archaeology. They and other leading voices in feminist archaeology over the past several decades have been drawing on a body of feminist philosophy of science literature that has been developed by our own philosopher of archaeology, Alison Wiley, alongside figures like Donna Haraway, Patricia Hill Collins, and Sandra Harding. All of these theorists have argued that knowledge is shaped by the social positions and experiences of the knowers, and that marginalized people have an epistemically privileged standpoint from which to understand their own marginalization. Haraway wrote about the God trick, in which the scientist pretends to view the world objectively, erasing their own biases, playing God. And Haraway reminded us that science is never actually omniscient and knowledge is always situated. Patricia Hill Collins theorized Black women's unique ways of understanding social inequality stemming from their intersectional, multiply marginalized positions. Sandra Harding has developed the theory of strong objectivity, in which she argues that research that begins with questions developed by marginalized thinkers is, in fact, more rigorous and objective than mainstream science due to the epistemic privilege of the question developers. All of these ideas have been brought into archaeology by feminist and anti-racist archaeologists, and they apply to other forms of oppression like ableism as well. Here, feminist archaeological theory, philosophy of science, and the disability movements are all perfectly in harmony. We cannot understand past communities without understanding their disabled members, and we cannot understand their disabled members unless those doing that understanding are disabled themselves and or working in collaboration with disabled people. We must dismantle the ableism that structures our discipline, supporting the disabled practitioners who are already here and inviting more disabled people in. We must engage with the critical theory that already exists and would be so useful for our work. We must include disabled non-archaeologists as interlocutors and community collaborators. All archaeology is the archaeology of disability, and I say nothing about us without us.